אני רוצה לשאול, מה לגבי הזריקה במקום דרך הווריד?
He's asking about daratumumab sub-Q because and not
Yeah.
IV. When
So-
it will
so-
be available. When it
So
will be available.
we're probably talking about sometime next year. Yeah. And there's another antibody very similar to daratumumab that will get approved now that is given less frequently than daratumumab and that the infusion is shorter. So even before daratumumab is available subcutaneously, there'll be another drug that is very similar to it that may be easier as well.
How do you decide in cases in the fourth line of treatment if a specific drug is not super potent enough? How do you decide which drug to add to do the combination?
Well,
I'm asking specifically about Dara.
So just you should know that in Israel, at least previously, Dara was a fourth line of therapy, and now it's already second line with Revlimid. But this lady specifically asked about Dara fourth line when it stopped working.
We don't know yet.
How do you know when you should move and where?
I mean that's a very complicated question, and I don't have an answer for it. It sort of depends on what drugs are available and how you were using the daratumumab. Daratumumab can be used many different ways, and sometimes you can use it with one partner and it doesn't work, and you can use it with another partner and it does.
What are the considerations in choosing if you want to add another drug to daratumumab? How do you decide which drug?
Well, unfortunately, very often that question is, what am I allowed to add, and not what would I add? So very often we're using daratumumab with Velcade, or we're using daratumumab with Revlimid, and I want to change to daratumumab plus pomalidomide, and the insurance company will say, no, you can't do that. So it depends on what insurance the patient has, and what drugs they've had previously, and what data you can give to support it. So probably the three best drugs that we have for multiple myeloma right now are daratumumab, carfilzomib, and pomalidomide. And I would love to use all three of those drugs in combination in patients, but I can't because government won't pay for it, and the insurance company won't pay for it. So and all of these drugs are obscenely expensive. So there are very, very few people who will say, I don't care, just give it to me, I'll write you a check. So sometimes the choices aren't our choices.
Do you have an environment? Do you have any environment of all doctors all over the world, or the experience of everyone? Everybody has a lot of experience, but do you have an environment to communicate to each other?
Yeah, I mean,
I just will repeat the question. אז האם יש איזשהו פורום שכל הרופאי מיאלומה מתקבצים, והתשובה היא כמובן כן, אבל אני אתן לפרופסור סיגל לנו.
So the last time we saw each other before today was in Boston a month ago, where basically all of the myeloma doctors in the world got together, and it's a different kind of meeting than some of the big scientific meetings where they present new data. This was a meeting where various experts spoke about their opinions about how to manage things. In fact, Dr. Liba was one of the speakers at the meeting, and she still hasn't given me the slides, did you, from your talk? But where exactly the question that you're asking, where we discuss what we think is the right thing to do in various circumstances, and understand that we don't agree. There is no absolutely right way to do this.
I would like to ask you a question. I will divide it into
two parts. You said
He's a politician.
No.
He's not running for office.
No, don't worry.
you said that you are pro-transplant.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering whether it is because the data of transplant is well known and you have a lot of experience with people who went through this process, vis-a-vis the other that you don't know the results. And now the second part is if you have two groups of patients and you know that they will reach the same relapse or a complete remission or even better, and you know who will reach this, who will reach it without transplant.
Yeah.
Will you still say that I will try, I will make the transplant, or it is because you don't know?
So the understand that none of us know. When you say no, it's always relative. It's more what we believe the data tells us. So there has never been a situation for any group of patients where transplant has been compared to non-transplant, where transplant is lost, right? So literally there are no clinical trials that say you should not transplant this patient, none. So transplant is easy. Anybody can do it. So you could go to the poorest part of the world, and if you build a clean building, you can do a stem cell transplant, and you can do it inexpensively. It does not require a great level of expertise. So it is an easy thing to do that can be done everywhere. It is very, very inexpensive to do. It has very, very little in the way of long-term side effects. So there is literally no argument not to do a stem cell transplant. And the answer is that there are those who will tell you, well, if you get to this level of response, it doesn't matter how you get there. But what I will tell you is we just finished one of our big data reviews from our own institution. So what that shows, and understand that we're not an institution that does maintenance therapy or anything after a stem cell transplant, and the overwhelming majority of our patients we transplant. I basically transplant everybody up to the age of 80. That 20% of our patients are still in a remission at 10 years. And I haven't been in our institution long enough to say what it is at 20 years, but data shows that if you are in remission at 10 years after a stem cell transplant, you have a 50-50 chance of still being in remission at 20 years after a stem cell transplant. So there is no therapy, none, still, with all the advances that we have made, that offers any possibility of data approaching that. So there are patients who will get 4 months of therapy and then a stem cell transplant who will never need to be treated again. And nothing else offers that. So is that a good answer to the question?
It is, but I just asked, if you know from the very beginning that without the transplant, they will reach.
So my answer is yes, I would still do the transplant because it's the least toxic thing that I do. So what is the most dangerous drug that we use to treat myeloma patients? Yeah.
Why, two questions. He has two, sir.
All right.
Why don't you transplant patients over 80?
I do I do.
Okay, the second question.
You have no limits.
The TCAR type treatment, would that also be for a certain age? Like, would there be ages where you wouldn't do that type of treatment?
So the reason that we don't transplant patients over 80 is because, referral centers don't get that many patients over 80. The local doctors tend to keep them, so we don't see that many patients over 80. The bottom line is, in an 80-year-old, I don't know that the goals are always the same goals. It is to just keep the disease controlled for some period of time, because I can do that relatively easily. And if I do, the patient has, most 80-year-olds have significant other comorbidities that will threaten their life. So, for a 50-year-old, it's a different set of objectives than it is for an 80-year-old. But if I had an 82-year-old or an 85-year-old who was refractory to their initial therapy, would I talk to them about doing a stem cell transplant? Yes. And the CAR T-cell question is, right now we don't have choices as to who it's for. That most of the clinical trials are being done in patients in 3rd, 4th, 5th, 8th relapse. And so most of those patients have had myeloma for a long time. So it's more defined by what they've been exposed to than how old they are. So would I do a CAR T-cell? Would I put a young patient on a CAR T-cell study? Yeah, I would. It's not, honestly, what's one of the interesting things about CAR T-cell therapy is you do it once, they spend 2 weeks in the hospital, and then they're done. Because it's a clinical trial, there's a lot of follow-up, so it's a lot of work. But it's not terribly demanding, because it's really just one day of therapy and then watch the patient for a couple of weeks. It's possible, but it's all as part of clinical trials. So you have to meet the eligibility of the clinical trial. Oh, so the question was about, is it possible to go to the United States and get CAR T-cell studies? The answer is yes, but insurance is always a big problem. Excuse me. The way that the CAR T-cell studies are done is patients very often have to sit and wait to have a slot available. Excuse me. And sometimes that's not feasible. What I've seen from Israel is that a lot of patients have ended up going to China to get CAR T cells. And in China, you can write a check and get your CAR T cell therapy, whereas in the United States, that you can't do that.
Is it safe in China?
The answer is I don't know.
Deciding which treatment to give to patient is cut and try process, or I am wrong?
Say it again.
Deciding which treatment you give to a patient, it's a cut and try process, or I am wrong? How you decide?
I think for the overwhelming majority of my patients, I start them on therapy very similarly. So most of my patients get what we call induction therapy, and in the United States, the two most common induction therapies are VRD and KRD, so Velcade, Revlimid, and dexamethasone, versus carfilzomib, Revlimid, and dexamethasone. So the overwhelming majority of my patients get one of those two combinations and then get a stem cell transplant. So for me, I don't think about it that much, because everybody's getting treated the same. Outside of the United States, it's VCD, Velcade, Cytoxan, and dexamethasone, or carfilzomib, Cytoxan, and dexamethasone starting to be used a little bit as well, although much, much rarer, and then go on to a stem cell transplant. Yeah, it's very difficult to explain. I gave my description of so when you have the flu, you know how you feel really terrible when you have the flu? Everything hurts, you feel like you're gonna die, because it's not the virus itself that makes you feel sick like that. It's your immune response to the virus. The immune response releases all kinds of inflammatory molecules that are what make you feel sick. Well, with CAR T cells, it's the same thing. It is these these immune cells that we've engineered that are releasing all kinds of inflammatory molecules. So it is a very similar experience to having the flu, except perhaps 10 times worse, because these inflammatory molecules stay around much longer. Now, in myeloma, we've been lucky in that most patients don't get really sick. We don't quite understand why, whether it's just that the CAR T cells that we're using in myeloma are different, or whether it is that myeloma patients, because they're much more immunosuppressed than other patients, that they're not capable of making these inflammatory responses, but we're not sure. But for the most part, myeloma patients do better with CAR T cells than lymphoma patients do.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
אוקיי, השאלה האחרונה.
Talked about you were pro-clinical trials, and although we know we're in very good hands here, I assume that revolutionary drugs, clinical trials are not taking place here in Israel. What is the best way you think we can access as Israeli citizens clinical trials for these kind of drugs abroad? Is it through our doctors?
I think so. So, you know, myeloma patients are different, and I don't know why myeloma patients are different, but myeloma patients seem to be much better organized and much more communicative than other patients. And part of why myeloma has become such a target disease for clinical trials is because of patient advocacy groups, that they've gone to the government, they've gone to those who make decisions about building the infrastructure to do clinical trials. They've been very outspoken about it. So when I first started taking care of myeloma, I used to go to drug companies and say, you know, I would love to use your drug to see whether it works in myeloma. And they would laugh at me and say, you know, why do we care about myeloma? There's not enough patients to make it worth our while. And now I get, I don't know, 5 or 6 emails a day from drug companies asking me if I'm interested in doing clinical trials in myeloma. I think that Israel would be literally the best country in the world to do clinical trials in general, but particularly in hematology and myeloma specifically, because literally you have the best doctors in the world. The training of Israeli hematologists is way better than the training of American hematologists. They have a history of being, you know, innovators. The country itself. So what the fight has to be about is building the infrastructure to allow clinical trials to be done here, because you don't have the availability of every drug, but you have doctors who are unbelievably experienced. The story that I will tell you is there is a drug that I think is a very, very important drug for treating myeloma. And the company that owned this drug, Merck Pharmaceutical, decided when they were going to do a big clinical trial in myeloma that they wanted to do it as easily as possible and as quickly as possible. So what did they do? They went all over the world looking for countries to participate in it. And where most of the work ended up being done was in Poland, in Russia, in Eastern Europe. And the trial was a mess. The patients who got the experimental drug died at a much, much higher frequency than the patients who didn't receive the experimental drug. And so the FDA and the company decided we're not doing any more research with this drug in multiple myeloma. Now, if you look at the data, and I had the privilege of looking at the data, if you looked at Japan as a country, the patients who were treated in Japan who got the experimental drug did way better than the patients who didn't get the experimental drug. And so what's the difference? It's that in Poland and Russia and Eastern Europe, the physicians aren't that good. They have very, very little experience with even the basic drugs that are used. So they were handed 2 drugs that they didn't understand. They were handed Revlimid that they had never seen before, and they were handed pembrolizumab that they had that they clearly hadn't seen before, and it was a disaster. So Israel is the place that they should be doing clinical trials, because you have doctors like here and Noah, who's sitting out in the hall, I think. So you have incredibly sophisticated physicians, but the bureaucracy of Israel, I know you didn't think there was any bureaucracy in Israel, but the bureaucracy of Israel keeps drug companies from doing clinical trials here, because it's too expensive, it's too hard. So you guys have to go and vote for politicians who say that they'll make that bureaucracy easier to deal with, so that you guys can get the opportunity to use these drugs early rather than after they're commercially available.
They have no problem, they go abroad anyway. So.
תודה רבה, תודה רבה.
The politicians do, yeah. Was that like a bad thing to say?
תודה רבה להרצאה מדהימה. Fascinating talk from פרופסור סיגל, תודה רבה באמת.